Welcome to the Simsbury Free Library for the Connecticut History in 4 Parts talk. I'm Tom Ratcliff. I teach Connecticut History at Central Connecticut State University. All right. As last time I told you I had about 2 or 3 hours worth of stuff, I have at least that much stuff today, so I'm going to be editing on the fly. I have some stuff on the PowerPoint. I don't really like, I like PowerPoint to be able to show you images and maps and charts and things like that. I use PowerPoint at school, and I look at my students' notebooks, and they're just copies of my PowerPoint slides. I'm not sure there's any like mental activity when they're just like writing it all down. So at any rate, Connecticut, the provision state, we've actually had, what, 4 nicknames? The Nutmeg State, Constitution State, the Provision State. Is there a 4th one? I should know that, right? Well, I'm sort of thinking out loud. My wife is used to the fact that sometimes I speak to her and I'm not really speaking to her. What's that?
The tax state.
I thought that was Massachusetts. And yeah.
We won.
We did? Okay, sorry. Yeah, all right. All right, the provision state was actually our first nickname, and it was given to, well, it was sort of given to us by George Washington. George Washington was close friends with Jonathan Trumbull, who was our governor through the entire Revolutionary period. And on a fairly regular basis, Washington was in dire need of supplies. And when all else failed, he would write a letter to the man he called Brother Jonathan. And Trumbull usually could figure out how to get supplies. For example, we all know about the terrible winter in Valley Forge, where several thousand men starved to death or died of disease. There were 2 separate occasions where we sent supplies down, including a cattle drive. There were about, I think, 100 cattle or so that they actually drove down. So Connecticut might be the first cowboy state, right? Is Wyoming the cowboy state today? I think it is. Yeah. All right. Okay. So let's do a little bit of background. In order to understand Connecticut within the Revolution, I think it's important to understand the way that Connecticut citizens looked at Connecticut. Connecticut was what one historian called a congregational commonwealth. The Puritans were Congregationalists, and the key issue for them, they didn't like the church structure. The Catholic Church, as you know, you have the Pope, you have archbishops, you have bishops, and you have the local parishes. The Congregationalists believe that each church community ought to be able to make their own decisions. They ought to be able to choose their own ministers. They ought to make their own decisions in terms of social issues and economic issues and things like that. And the Reformation in England, the Church of England, while they made a number of reforms, they kept the bishops. And so that was a key area of dissent between the Puritans and the Anglicans. So at any rate, being a congregational commonwealth, it's sort of good news and bad news. If you believe that each member of the church community ought to have a say in what's happening, that's really a democratic society. So I think we have the roots of democratic society, which is coming from that. The problem is it's only a democratic society if you're a member of the church. If you're a dissenter, if you're a slave, you're out of luck, right? So if you're not a member of the church community, you are actually discriminated against. So it's really a two-edged sword, I guess, is the best way to say it. Early on, for a community to form, the very first thing that you have to do is apply to be a church community. So, for example, if we look at colonial Farmington, which included Avon, Plainville, Southington, New Britain, Berlin, Bristol, Burlington, I think parts of West Hartford, as people from Farmington moved north into what is now Avon, the very first thing they did when they got enough people together, they decided they didn't like traveling that far to have to go to church, so they applied to be an ecclesiastical society. The state legislature gave them permission to do that. They took the name Northington. They were the North Parish of Farmington. Hired a minister, and then so that was the first step. And then I think it was the 1820s that they actually became incorporated as Avon itself. So the church was an essential part of the political growth of the colony. Now, the Puritans believed that you had to be born again. You had to have a religious experience as an adult where you, I guess born again is the best way I can describe it. In order to be a full church member, you had to be recognized by the church elders and the other church members. And in order to do that, you had to go before them and tell your story. And your story did not include seeing a burning bush, having the Archangel Gabriel come down on a cloud, or having God speak to you, because the Puritans knew that once they finished writing the Bible, none of that stuff had happened. So if you said that, they would think you were a heretic or a witch, and either way, it wasn't going to end well for you. The story you had to tell went something like this. For many years, I knew I wasn't saved. I knew I was a sinner. I knew that the grace and glory of God was out of reach for me. And then one day I had this little flicker in my heart, and I started to feel the warmth and the love of God, and suddenly I knew that I was saved. And if you told the story that way and you were convincing, then the church elders would say hallelujah, and you would be admitted to full church membership. Full church membership meant you could be a citizen, it meant you could vote, it meant you could take communion. In the first generation of Puritans, what we see is a very high percentage of these people they called visible saints, right? This makes sense, I think, because virtually, if you go back to, say, 1650, virtually everybody living in Connecticut, the population was maybe 12 or 1,400, everyone in Connecticut had voted with their feet. They had left England. They were dissenters, right? So they had their religion was very important to them. But then you get what I call generational dissonance. If you have kids, you know what that is? Yeah. Well, let's be fair. Let's go the other way. I don't know about you, but I look at my grandparents, and especially my great-grandparents, and their values and ideas about life. I would say generations removed. That's almost repetitive, right? And anyway, what happens is the children of Puritans, they're born in this country. They don't have that same experience. They weren't persecuted. They didn't have to give up everything they had to come here. They have a better life. They're more comfortable with it. They're all raised within the church, but if we say that 75% of the first generation are saved, maybe only 50% of the second generation are saved. And then when we get to the third generation, it's going to drop even more. So the question becomes, what do you do about this? As long as we're all members of the church community and we're all on the same page, we have a monolithic society. We have the same belief system. We believe that our religious leaders and our political leaders ought to be pretty much the same people, right? As church membership starts to decline, though, the prestige and power of the church starts to decline, and more and more, you get more and more dissent entering in. So they come up with something called the halfway covenant. Let's suppose my wife and I are both saved, we're both saints, and my son isn't. The halfway covenant says that the children of saints can become part-time or halfway members of the church. They can't take communion, but other than that, they're full members. So that works for a while, but some people don't like that idea, right? By the time we get to the third generation, it's collapsing even more, and there's a great deal of dissent. So they come up with something, the church leaders get together, and they come up with something called the Saybrook Platform. What the Saybrook Platform says is that what the individual church communities ought to do is elect representatives, form a board, and then handle problems within individual church communities, handle problems with dissent, handle problems with ministers that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And some people thought this was a really great idea, and other people said, this looks like Presbyterianism. It looks like you have a council of elders that's making decisions, and that's antithetical or completely opposed to this idea of the independence of the congregation, right? So you start to get this division within the congregational society. You get some people that agree more with this Presbyterian viewpoint. You get some people that agree more with the congregational viewpoint. By about 1850, to jump ahead, it was not uncommon for people to look at congregations. They were called Presbygationals, because it just seemed like they were all the same thing. They just had these sort of minor differences, right? At any rate, so it's important for us to see that we here in Connecticut, we had a very strong sense of democracy, the idea that we had our independence, that the laws that we passed were inviolate, holy. We didn't have a lot of the problems that other colonies had. So by the time we get to the beginning of the Revolution, the number of people in Connecticut that supported the Revolution was pretty high. In some places it wasn't so much, but here in Connecticut it was. Let's see, let me just check. We get the Great Awakening. Do we know the Great Awakening? Along about 1730 or so, there was a series of revivals. And in the old days, if you went to church in, say, 1720 here in town, the sermon you would hear from the Congregational minister, it was very long, it was 2 or 3 hours long. It was like listening to a college lecture or maybe even a lawyer sum up his case, right? There were lots of quotes from the Bible and from literature, and it was logically laid out to you why this was a certain way, why heaven was where it was, why God did what he did. And it was all based on appealing to your intellect. And what the Great Awakening is, the shorthand version of it is people wanted emotion. People wanted that hellfire and brimstone. People wanted that I think the greatest sermon of that era is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Very Old Testament kind of, and that was what Jonathan Edwards, the great premise there is that we're hanging over the fires of hell by a thin spider web, one strand. And oh my goodness, what's it going to take for us to fall into the pit? So this was very popular. Some people that this really appealed to. So you have this emotional appeal on one side, and you have this intellectual appeal on the other side, and eventually you get this division to where you have the old lights, the old-fashioned Congregationalists who like the intellectual side of religion, and then you have the new lights who want the fire and brimstone. Unfortunately, what happens in this is that the power of the Congregational ministers will be diminished, because if I'm the Congregational minister here in town and I'm preaching to you and you all like my preaching and you all don't, you all leave. And you find someone else to preach to, and my income depends on all of you paying your church taxes. So suddenly, it's not just that I'm losing prestige in this community, I can't feed my family, right? That was another part of the Congregational Commonwealth, is your taxes supported the minister. 15% of that could actually be in firewood, which was important because in colonial times, the average man spent about a third of his life cutting wood, right? Because houses were not insulated, they were drafty, chimneys were terrible, the fireplaces were just awful, so so the firewood was extremely, you just reminded me I had water. So at any rate, what's going to happen is the Great Awakening, it's going to hit eastern Connecticut the hardest. So in the eastern, let's see, from your point of view, this would be eastern Connecticut. Eastern Connecticut is going to be very, very strongly new light, and it's these new lights that are also going to be the strongest patriots. Also at this time, eastern Connecticut is more populated than western Connecticut. Today, it's just the opposite, right? We talk about the quiet corner, and New London County has, more sheep per acre than cows or people or whatever. But on the other hand, in western Connecticut, what's happening increasingly is a lot of the people in western Connecticut, they're trading with New York. So they have more connections to the mother country. They tend to be more loyal. And lots of them during the Great Awakening, they convert to Anglicanism. So you have a number of people, you have Western Connecticut, the closer you get to New York, the more likely you have that someone's going to be a Tory, someone's not going to support the revolution. So I think that's a good place to start here. So, all right, so let's look at the British colonies in 1774. There were 32 colonies that they had in North America. There were 12 in the Caribbean, 20 in North America. Now, of the 20 in North America, you have the 13 original colonies, right? We all know them, right? Did we learn those in 4th grade? Yeah. Yeah, my daughter's in 3rd grade, and they just talked to her about Native Americans, so that's coming. Along with that, you had East and West Florida, which had been obtained at the end of the French and Indian War. And Canada was actually 5 separate colonies. You had Quebec, Nova Scotia, the island of St. John's, Newfoundland, and then Rupert's Land, which was all of this up in here, which was really controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company, right? So the question we always ask is, you have 32 colonies. What is it that the 13 have in common that they connect with? Why are they the ones that rebel? And just as a sidelight, we always looked at Canada as our potential 14th colony/state, right? So we made several efforts during the Revolution to either convince the Canadians to join us. We tried to invade Canada a couple of times. We tried to invade Canada during the War of 1812. The beginning of the American Civil War, one of Lincoln's advisors said, if we invade Canada, the South will get caught up in a patriotic cause, they'll rejoin the Union, and we can take Canada like we've always wanted to. So it was not an idea that went away easily. So, and then there was also this area back here which is called the Indian Territory, Now, if we start in 1763, which is the end of the French and Indian War, we would find that probably a significant percentage of people living in the Americas were proud to be British. The French and Indian War had essentially meant that the French who were in Quebec and in much of the Mississippi River Valley, they had essentially been kicked out. So as far as we were concerned here in Connecticut, what we saw is there was lots of new land to explore and to settle. The threat of the French was gone. The French were notorious for stirring up the Native Americans against us. So it looked like things were going to be getting better. The British government decided two things. The first is that because they wanted to take over the French fur trade in this region, and we'll think about the Mississippi Valley all the way up into Quebec, they were going to have to put soldiers out there to guard from the French coming in, and to also keep American settlers out, because they were pretty sure that American settlers were going to annoy the Native Americans, and then there'd be trouble, and then they'd lose money. So, in order to put the soldiers out there, they figured that someone would have to pay for that, and who better but the American colonists. The second thing they did is they said, they drew a line, an imaginary line down what would be the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, and they said, past this line, you're not supposed to go. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and what it said was, all your colonial charters end there. Now, if you remember Connecticut's colonial charter, what was our western boundary? The Pacific Ocean, yeah, it was way out here, right? That was true of a number of colonies. So with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, most people, especially the Virginians, were looking at the Ohio River Valley and saying, wow, this is an area that we can settle. It's rich farmland, it's great hunting land, and that proclamation line really, it put a damper on things. So. Oh, the other thing that they did at the end of the French and Indian War is in order to win, in Europe it was called the 7 Years' War, in order to defeat the French, they had borrowed a lot of money from the Bank of England. So the national debt of England had essentially doubled in about 5 years. And because they wanted to pay it down, they thought, well, we'll just start taxing everyone, and that will help to pay things down, right? So that's where we're going to get the Sugar Act and Stamp Act and all of those other issues there, right? Does that work? Okay, so let's look at Connecticut in 1774. This is actually a map of where there were still Native American presence, but it was the best map I could find. We had done a survey in 1774. We'd actually started doing surveys about 1750. This was our third survey in about 20 years. Not quite 200,000 people. It included 1,363 Indians and about 5,000 Negroes. Most of these were slaves. We only had 6 counties. Let's see. Well, Fairfield, Litchfield, New Haven, Hartford, New London, and Windham. Tollenden, Middlesex didn't have enough people to warrant being counties at that point. There were 73 towns, no cities. The first 5 cities were designated in 1784. And I'm trying to, it's Hartford, New Haven, Middletown, Norwich, and New London, I think, were the 5. So. Hartford and New Haven were co-capitals. We talked about that last time, the idea of the New Haven colony hadn't wanted to join the Connecticut colony. All right, let's look at our demographics some more. This is a nice, very lovely map of the counties, I think. All right, the largest town was Farmington. That's physically an area. It was 225 square miles. That was going to change pretty quickly because Southington was going to gain their independent or become a separate town, followed by, I think, Berlin and then New Britain. And so it's the most people are in New Haven, 8,200. Hartford was actually 8. It only had about 5,000 people in it. And then again, to the east, we have these these new lights, the Congregational Patriots. The support for the revolution is very strong in the east, and in the west, there were an awful lot of ties. The closer you got down here, especially down here in Fairfield County, there were lots and lots and lots of connections to New York. Now, once the war starts, the demand for goods is going to skyrocket. The price of food is going to skyrocket. So early on, what Connecticut's going to do, we're going to pass an embargo that it's illegal to export any kind of foodstuffs at all. Grain, like wheat, corn, peas, beans, onions, potatoes, pigs, chickens, horses, cheese, butter, all of that stuff, you can't export it because it's understood that if we're going to send our militiamen out to fight, we're going to have to feed them every day. And it's also understood that there's going to be a black market develop and there's going to be people that are going to try to profit from this. There were a number of people, especially in this region, who were trading with the British in New York. There was a shortage of what they call specie, which is gold and silver coin. The British had lots of gold and silver. And they're willing to pay premium prices for food. So there were lots of people that would smuggle either down the Long Island Sound or across to, because there were some British fortifications fairly close there. So there's some people made a lot of money at it, and some people got in a lot of trouble for doing it. So unfortunately, I know we look at the founding fathers and we think they were all just really great guys. Lots of them were crooked. Lots of them were out for looking for their own interests. And unfortunately, even members of Congress, even people that signed the Declaration were not what we would call stellar shining examples of humanity, right? All right, so let's look at the British objectives here in the war. This is King George III. The British wanted to have a deep water port. They had to have a deep water port. They had 35,000 troops here throughout the war. That's through 8.5 years. They had to feed them breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day. They had to provide uniforms and weapons and gunpowder and lead for shot and bandages and blankets and horses and wagons and cannon. And they needed a steady supply of ships coming in and out, and you couldn't do that unless you had a deep water port, which is why in the beginning of the war, when they get bottled up in Boston, they're not all that upset about it, because Boston's a pretty good port and you have a pretty good flow of ships coming in and out. When they leave Boston, they end up in New York, and they stay in New York because New York is the third largest harbor in the world, right? So, the other thing they wanted to do was blockade American ports. They understood that we had limited resources and that we were probably going to try to trade with their traditional enemy, France, as well as the Spanish and the Dutch. So they thought if they could blockade American ports or shut down American shipping, that would be one of their key war objectives, right? The other thing they wanted to do was raid the rebel supplies, which they did on a regular basis, especially here in Connecticut. There were a couple places we had storehouses, so we got raided more than once. And the other goal they had was to keep France and Spain out of the war. They had just defeated the French and the Spanish in the 7 years / French and Indian War. And since France had lost their New World Empire, it wasn't too hard to figure out that the French would love to help the British lose their New World Empire, right? Sort of to get even with them. All right, on the other side, the American objectives. This is one that I think confuses people. Resolution. When fighting started, it wasn't a given that this was a full-blown war. Lexington and Concord is what, middle of April '75. It's 15 months later when the resolution comes up for the Declaration of Independence. It takes 15 months to convince people this is a good idea. You know, when John Adams gets up early on and says, we're going to declare independence and we're going to be free and we're going to beat the British, they thought he was either drunk or crazy. So there are a number of attempts at resolution on both sides. So it's only after, see, for a long time we thought that it was Parliament were the big bad guys and that King George was really our friend, and sooner or later he'd realize that and he'd come to our rescue. When he didn't come to our rescue, especially when he hired Hessian mercenaries to fight against us, when we wrote the Declaration of Independence, we didn't say Parliament's to blame, we blamed King George. The Declaration is really a nasty letter to the king. Because if you get beyond the eloquent, you know, in the course of human events, it comes down to he has, and it's he, and it's King George, King George, King George. So anyway, so resolution was the first idea. Whether or not we resolved or not, we wanted to seize Canada. Eventually, we realized that if we were going to have a full-blown war, we had to figure out how to either outlast them or defeat them. I think one of the things Washington was really, really good at was retreating. He'd get into a battle and he'd see it wasn't going his way. The European way was to go, okay, you got me, okay. It was like a chess game, right? You know, hey, you know, you beat me today, I'll get you tomorrow. He was very, very good at backing up. He was very, very good at keeping his troops in the field, keeping them supplied, keeping morale high, which is really hard when you're losing, right? You can only imagine what it's like for the New York Giants now at 0-6 to be, you know, I wouldn't want to be in that locker room, right? The other thing that our goal was to raid enemy shipping. If we understand that the British need, let's say, 10 to 12 really big merchantmen can probably hold as much as, let's say, what, maybe 8 or 10 tractor-trailer trucks. So if you have this continuous convoy of ships coming in, if we can raid that, we do two things. We limit what the enemy has, and we put it in our own pockets, stomachs, guns, whatever, right? So raiding enemy shipping was extremely important. And then ideally, a foreign alliance. Very early on, we sent, I almost said John Dean, that's Watergate, right? Silas Dean to France. He was originally a secret correspondent, but the idea was early on, we were trying to get the French involved in some way. And I think about 90% of the gunpowder we used during the war we got from the French one way or another. Either it was smuggled in before the alliance. In 1778, we signed 2 treaties. It was perpetual friendship and commerce. And the idea was that they would come in and help us. And then in later years, if it ever worked out that the French were fighting the English, we were supposed to come in and help the French. And when the French Revolution started, and the French said, okay, we have this treaty here, come on, help us out. And Washington said, you know, I think foreign entanglements are not really a good idea. The French got rather upset with us, right? So anyway, that's a whole other, maybe we'll get to that next time. I think understanding the war in the North, and we're mostly involved in the war in the North, is to understand the wilderness forts here. The British, they're using Canada as a base, and also Nova Scotia up here. And so on a regular basis, we're trying to invade Canada this way, and they're trying to come out of Canada this way. And there's a number of forts up there that are extremely important. I don't know if you can even see them. On the Hudson River in Lake Champlain, which is like right here, you have Fort Ticonderoga, which is up at the top there. You have Fort William and Fort Edward. Have we read Last of the Mohicans? Yeah, those are the two forts. Yeah, sure. Cooper has some really lovely prose describing this absolute wilderness area and what a key it was to having the army so far apart and then trying to fight. And it's the same thing in the American Revolution. So, and anyway, in the Mohawk River Valley, which is right here, you have Fort Stanwix, which is up here, and Oswego over here. So, all right. So, we get to Lexington and Concord. Shots are fired in Lexington. Prior to this point, there were committees of correspondence. There were letters passed back and forth. Maybe we should talk about we know the Boston Tea Party? Okay. After the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament, they're going to pass a series of acts which they call, They call them the coercive acts because they're trying to force us into compliance, and we call them the intolerable acts. The first thing they do is they shut down the Massachusetts legislature. Now what the Massachusetts legislature does is they pack up, they move out of town, and they start meeting in secret, right? So you have the shadow government. The second thing they do is they ban town meetings. The third thing they do is they shut down the port of Boston. If you can imagine, if you shut down the port of New York tomorrow, what would happen to the banks? What would happen to businesses? What would happen to the stock market? You know, it was a serious economic blow. So in response to the coercive acts or the intolerable acts, we started to organize. We started to get ready. We put our militia on extra training, for example. And then, of course, the other thing that happens is the First Continental Congress is called, right? So in the fall of 1774, they meet in Philadelphia to try to figure out a unified response to what the British are doing. And I think it's here that John Adams gets up and says, you know, we just ought to not take it from him. We ought to just start kicking butt and taking names. And again, they thought he was nuts, right? Eventually, they come to see him as a... It's easy to be a visionary when you're proved right, right? When you're proved wrong, they just think you're crazy. So at any rate, there had been lots and lots of preparations. People were waiting for word that the fighting had actually begun. And so we get this Lexington letter. This is the actual text. I was going to use the actual image, but it's written in, you know, a quill pen and all that. And it's hard to read. So Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock. So this is a response to Lexington. Concord hasn't really happened yet, right? It says, to the friends of American liberty, be it known this morning, before the break of day, a brigade consisting of 1,000 to 1,200 men landed at Phipps Farm near Cambridge and marched to Lexington, where they found a company of our colonial militia in arms, upon whom they fired without any provocation. Is that true? We don't really know who fired first, right? That's the shot heard round the world, right? Killing 6 men, wounding 4 others. By an express from Boston, we find another brigade are now upon their march from Boston, supposed to be about 1,000. I don't think that was true. The bearer, Israel Bissell, he was from East Windsor, right, is charged to alarm the country, quite to Connecticut, and all persons are desired to furnish him with fresh horses as they may be needed. I have spoken with several persons who have seen the dead and wounded. Pray the delegates from the colony of Connecticut see this. And he signs it, J. Palmer, one of the Committee of Safety. So Bissell is going to ride to, it's 36 miles to Worcester. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. And he puts this footnote in the end here. He says, the Committee of Safety, they know Colonel Foster, who's from Brookfield, Connecticut. He's one of the delegates. So this guy's trying to convince people as they're reading this that this is a true document, that this is really happening, right? Not that people need to know it, because what's happening is Bissell rides along. He's shouting to arms, the war has started, and everywhere the Minutemen are getting their weapons, and they don't have to stop and read the letter. When he gets to Worcester, supposedly his horse drops dead because he had ridden the 36 miles in 2 hours. Every place he stops, what they have to do is they have to copy the letter down, right? Because they don't have Xerox machines, right? It's not like on my computer and I can hit print, right? And also along the way, people add their notes. So if you came through Simsbury and I was sort of a leading official that other people would recognize, I would sign it and say, I've read this, and I put my name on it. So then when it gets down to Farmington, someone would read it and say, oh yeah, Tom, if Tom's saying this is real, this is real. So you get that continuous response. So he leaves at 10 a.m. He gets to Worcester in 2 hours. And again, his horse dies. He spends the rest of the day in Worcester as they're trying to make plans. He leaves the next morning. He rides for Norwich. He gets there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I believe he stays there again. The next day he rides to New Haven. So you can see it's, let's see now. Today, what would you do? Send a text message? Get out your cell phone? Yeah. Send a Snapchat to someone. You all Snapchat? Yeah. My kids all Snapchat. He eventually, and he stopped along the way, and he rode lots of, he got to Philadelphia in 126 hours. So There are a lot of people who say, Paul Revere, what did he do? I mean, here's a guy who's a real hero. Here's a guy who was a real messenger. He really spread the word, right? So at any rate, as Bissell comes through Connecticut, a number of people respond. This is Israel Putnam. Do we know Israel Putnam? He was 57 at the time. Not, you think of war as a young man's game, right? He rides for Boston. He doesn't really ride for Boston. What he does is he rides south. He's looking for the governor. He ends up having to ride from, well, he's up in Pomfret here, and he rides all the way down to Lebanon here, right? Converses with the governor, and then rides up to Boston. So and he supposedly, we know the story of Cincinnatus, the Roman general. He's in the field, he's plowing, and he puts down his plow and he runs off to his. Supposedly this is what Putnam does. He doesn't go home and tell his wife. He's out there with his son. He gets on his horse with his musket, and he says to his son, tell my wife I love her, or something silly like that. And he rides off. So he's the typical citizen soldier, right? Benedict Arnold, we know Benedict Arnold? Good Connecticut boy. He marches the New Haven militia up to Boston. And I think this is a good example of how people felt, or the dissent that people felt. Because when he heard about, well, when Bissell came through town, he mustered the militia. He was, I think, a major at the time. And he got them ready. He said, men, we're going to march off. And he had to go get the key to the powder storage room from the town fathers. And the town fathers, they met in taverns at the time. So he walks into the tavern and he says, the men are mustered and ready to go. I need the key to the powder room. We're off to Boston to fight the dirty British. And the town fathers said, you're out of your mind. Because nobody wanted King George to know that the fathers, that the people of New Haven were fighting against him, right? There was a real serious concern there. So they said, we're not going to give you the key. Go home, sleep it off, do whatever you have to do. This is not happening. So he goes outside, and he has his men surround the tavern, and he comes in with his pistols drawn, and he said, I really want the keys. And they said, oh, you mean these keys? And they gave them to him, and he loaded up his men with powder, and he marched all the way to Boston. And not only did he march all the way to Boston, but as he went through each town, he would send a runner in to announce the fact that they were coming. So it was like a Memorial Day parade through each little town and community as he went through, as people were cheering and saying, so Arnold had a real flair for the dramatic. So initially, about 3,600 volunteers head off to Boston, mostly as individuals. In some cases, they were militia companies. In some cases, they were like Putnam. Eventually, the state we're going to send 6,000 of our militiamen up to fight. And this is when we pass an embargo on foodstuffs. Right away, it's understood that food is going to be extremely important. One of the things that one of the first things the state legislature did is they created a commissary, and they actually appointed the governor's son Joseph as the head of the commissary, and we passed legislation listing exactly the food that would be supplied to each soldier every day. It was 3/4 of a cup of peas, and so much grain, and so much beer, and so much pork, and this actually became a standard that other states adopted, and the Continental Army actually adopted this because it was so thorough and so well done. And eventually, Joseph Trumbull is going to be the first commissar. He's going to be the first commissar of the Continental Army. That's what I'm trying to say. Yes. He's going to be replaced by one of the Wadsworths, I think. So the Connecticut people have a lot to do with that. All right. Fort Ticonderoga. Have we been to Fort Ticonderoga? It's quite lovely. It had been a French fort. It was Fort Carillon, and the British had seized it in about 1761. And this is way up there in the middle of nowhere. It's an outpost. With the British, stuck in Boston, and the Americans surrounding Boston. And Boston back then was a peninsula. It was like an island with a little Boston neck. I meant to put an image up there and I forgot. So the British were stuck and couldn't get out, but the British were happy being there. So the Americans figured out early on that we needed cannon, and if we had cannon, we could threaten the British ships. And if we could threaten the British ships with cannon, the British would get up and leave. And that's exactly what happened, but we didn't have any cannon. So Benedict Arnold comes up with the idea, and Ethan Allen came up with the same idea at the same time somehow. We know Ethan Allen, not the furniture guy, but Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, yeah. So let's see. Allen got a commission from, I think, Connecticut, and Arnold got one from Massachusetts, or the other way around. But they both had commissions to lead troops up there to seize the cannon at Fort Ticonderoga. So, they set off separately, and somewhere along the line they met. Allen had more men, so he thought he was in charge. Benedict Arnold had a bigger ego, so he thought he was in charge. So basically for about 2 weeks, as they're traveling through the woods, they keep arguing about who's really in charge, right? And whose commission is more important, because they're both, I think, commissioned as majors. And at any rate, when they get to Fort Ticonderoga, they discover the gate is open, ajar. When they peek inside the gate, the guard's asleep. And either A, the people at Fort Ticonderoga don't know what's happening in Boston, or don't think they have anything to worry about, because they're literally, I mean, they might as well be on the moon. They're so far removed from everything, right? So, so this is a very famous painting. I've seen other paintings where the commander is actually in bed, and he wakes up with Arnold on one side and Ethan Allen on the other side, and they essentially. Supposedly, I think it's Allen. I mean, this is Arnold. You can see how dramatic he is. He says, "Who commands this fort?" And the commanding officer said, "Well, I did, but it looks like you do now," right? So, at any rate, they needed the cannon to end the siege. So Arnold and Ethan Allen, the fort's taken completely by surprise. I don't think there was a shot fired. I think there were about 41 cannon that they took, and General Henry Knox, he's given the job of hauling the cannon back to Boston. Let's see, that's what, about 175 miles? No roads, swamps, mountains, wintertime. Yeah, this was, they seized them in May. He got them back in late February, early March. So it took him a very, very long time to do it. This is Henry Knox he's the first Secretary of War under Washington. He's also the guy that we named Fort Knox for, right, where we keep all the gold. Right. So we still have gold, don't we? Or it's probably all gone, right? Yeah, okay. All right. Let's look at Benedict Arnold a little bit. Benedict Arnold is an interesting guy. He's born in Norwich, Connecticut. There are lots of stories about his childhood. I think it's real easy after the fact to look back and ask people, you know how you're asking people after somebody has done something really terrible, what was he like as a boy? Oh, he was always kind of crazy. He was kind of a little off. And that's what a lot of the stories are about Arnold. So I don't know how much of that I believe. I understand after the fact that everybody thought he was an evil person, and they're trying to look into his life and say, well, he was kind of a crazy kid. So there's all these stories about him. Some might be true. I don't know that they all are. I know his father was an alcoholic, spent a lot of the family fortune, whatever there was. And when his father died, he went to live with his uncles in New Haven, and his uncles in New Haven were up-and-coming merchants. They eventually bought some ships, and they were engaged in the trade to the West Indies. Arnold eventually he owned a drugstore. That wasn't a CVS, it was what we'd call an apothecary, right? So he sold all sorts of interesting things. But he had a store in New Haven, he had 1 or 2 ships. So he's one of those sort of middle-class, successful guys who, when the revolution starts, or even when the British start to tax sugar and things like that, he's one of those people that strongly opposes what's happening, right? So he's a New Haven merchant, he's engaged in the West Indies trade. Early on, he's responsible for getting the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Later that year, he plans an invasion of Canada. He gets up to Quebec and actually he leads an attack. Is it New Year's Eve? He actually gets to the main gate and almost gets in, and as he's coming into the gate, he takes a bullet in one of the knees, and he's hauled away. He comes that close to actually taking the city of Quebec. So the next year, he's still up in Canada, and the British are trying to launch an invasion down Lake Champlain. He actually builds a navy, right? He gets boat builders and carpenters. He builds a small fleet, and he actually fights against the British and slows them down enough that he thwarts that invasion. So the invasion that they would have liked to have had happen over that winter is delayed for the better part of a year. So 1777, later in the year, he's home in New Haven on leave, and he hears the British have attacked Danbury. He leads 500 men off to, it's actually, I think, Norwalk, where they landed, and he leads a very valiant, he lines his men up across the road and just dares the British to take him. There's about 2,000 British soldiers. Many of them are drunk or hungover, but they're able to drive Arnold's men out, and Arnold's there on his horse, and everybody's running away, and he's either extremely brave or crazy, but he's the last person to leave, and he's screaming at his men, come on, come on, come on, and his horse gets shot, and he falls down on the leg that was injured, right? So he's laying there with 1,200 pounds of horse on him, and he's trying to pull himself out, and a British soldier comes up and points his gun at him, and he says, "Sir, you are my prisoner," and Arnold supposedly pulls out his pistol, kills the guy, pulls himself out from underneath the horse, runs in, jumps in the ditch, and escapes, right? So it was things like this that the men that followed him, they had a great deal of admiration for him, you know. And I think Washington had the same sort of presence in battle. You know, Washington, I don't know how many times Washington had, at the end of a battle, he'd take his coat off and there'd be 4 or 5 bullet holes, or his hat would get shot off. You know, he almost got killed so many times, and Arnold was really the same. So the Battle of Saratoga, he almost wins the battle single-handedly. He turns around the American forces when the British are starting to rout them and drive them out of their position. There's a statue to him at Saratoga. Have you ever been to Saratoga? There's a statue to him. Well, it's not a statue of him, it's a statue of his boot. Because as he's leading his men into the last little sally port, the back door, what happens is he gets injured in the leg again, and he's laying there, and he takes off his boot, and he's pouring the blood out of his boot as the British are running away, and so there's a statue of his boot. And you find the it doesn't have his name. It says, "On the spot, the hero of the Battle of Saratoga was wounded." No name. If he had died there, I think he'd be on our money. If he had survived and not done anything else, I think he would have been like our second or third president. He was extremely popular, extremely interesting guy. And then, of course, by 1780, he's married to Peggy Shippen. He makes attempts to turn over the fort at West Point. And today, if you call someone a Benedict Arnold, it's like, whoa, right? All right. So how do we prepare for the war? This is Black Rock Fort, New Haven. Have you been to Black Rock Fort, New Haven? Yeah, okay. We built coastal forts in New Haven and New London. There are also other preparations made in Fairfield and I think in Norwalk as well. Eventually we're going to recruit 8 regiments, which is called the Connecticut Line. We're going to have 28 militia regiments. So you can fight in the state militia, you can fight in the Continental Army, or we have a third group. These are kind of like the backup. They were called state troops, and they were used for emergencies. So when, for example, when the British leave Boston in March of 1776, and Washington is trying to get down to New York as quickly as possible because he's pretty convinced that's where the British are going, we send some of our state troops down under Salic Silliman. So they're used there. They're used sometimes to replace militia regiments if men need to come home or take leave or anything. So you have 3 different ways that you can serve. They actually had to offer bounties to get some people to enlist. And sometimes it was quite a bit of money. It was as much as, I think, 40 pounds. There was also another where if two men could convince a third man to enlist, they would actually get a bounty. And I'm not sure how that worked, because I think if I were going to enlist, I would want to get the bounty myself. But all right. So how do we get the name of the provision state? Oh, we already talked about that, right? Okay. But today, of course, we're the Constitution state, right? Do all your license plates say that? Right. That's because then, was it 1958, the state legislature passed a law that said we're known as the Constitution state, right? Okay. One of the things that is important for us in Connecticut is the iron furnaces in Salisbury. If you remember last time, I'll use this as my Connecticut model, right? Remember last time I said that this northwestern corner of Connecticut, that's the original North American bedrock, right? So there's lots of really good rich iron ore there, and then in the next band along there, there's lots of limestone, and that comes from that ancient coral reef that we collapsed into. So this was one of the best areas in the country till about 1840 or 1850 for producing iron. The problem is there's no coal up there. So what we were using is, there's lots and lots of trees, so we're making lots of charcoal. All right, so there's iron ore, there's limestone, there's lots and lots of charcoal. Have we been up around People's Forest up in that region there? Yeah, so there's up in the forest itself, there's actually places they have samples of the charcoal stacks, right? So there are iron furnaces, and in the iron furnace, what you're doing is you're refining, right? And then you have forges, and in the forges, you're actually hammering out so you make the pig iron, and then you shape it. Under the Navigation Acts, I think it was probably by 1740, the British outlawed iron forges in the colonies because they wanted to sell us the pig iron, right? So they were actually operating illegally up here, and when the war starts, this is one of the few places in the colonies where we can make iron. And of course, the big issue is cannon. You can't have a cannon without cannonballs, right? And the other thing is there's lots of things aboard ship, especially anchor chains, I think is the easiest. Have we been to Mystic Seaport? Seen some of the anchor chains, they're like so big you can't lift one of the links, yeah. So that's an extremely important aspect. Okay, Connecticut's Navy. Didn't know we had a Navy, did you? We had a total of 13 ships. Probably the most famous was the Oliver Cromwell. This is a scale model of the Oliver Cromwell. I don't know if some child made it or if it's made out of, I think it's made out of wood, but obviously without the masts, right? The Cromwell was, what, about a 28-gun frigate, I would guess. Most of our Navy, early on we had great success, and I think we had great success because the British didn't expect us. So we had the element of surprise. When the British started looking for our ships, we were pretty easily, the ships were destroyed or captured. So by about 1779, there wasn't much really happening in that area. We were known for our shipbuilding, right? So after this point, what we're doing is really patrolling Long Island Sound. Interestingly enough, Long Island was a hotbed of Tories, and Connecticut's a hotbed of Patriots. It's not that far across. So on a regular basis, there were raids conducted. One of the most famous raids was by Major Meigs. He attacked a British supply depot and did a great deal of damage. Another raid, Gold Selleck Silliman, who was one of the generals of our militia. Was he lead general? He was actually kidnapped. He lived in Fairfield, and some Tories, they crossed Long Island Sound at night. They raided his house. They kidnapped him and his son, and I think he spent about 13 or 14 months before he was traded, right? He was traded for, I think, 1 or 2 British officers, which is, I think, why they kidnapped him in the first place, right? All right, the USS Trumbull. The is it the U.S. government? The Continental Congress decided that we ought to have a Navy, and they figured we ought to have 13 ships, 1 per each state. And technically, each state was supposed to build their own. So the one we built was the USS Trumbull, named for Jonathan Trumbull, right? So it's one of 13 Continental vessels. It was built in Chatham. Do you know where Chatham is? Chatham is, today, is it Portland today, I think? Yeah, it's up by Middletown. Yeah, it was really a very lovely sailing vessel. The only problem is the mouth of the Connecticut River. There's this big, huge sandbar, and the guy building the Trumbull didn't take that into account. So the ship was the draft was too big to get out of the river even at high tide. Yeah, so it's a 28-gun frigate. So they built it in 76, and I think it's 79 before they actually get it out. And what they figure out what to do, yeah, they tie water casks all along the ship right below the water line, filled with water. And then they pump the water out of all the casks, and the ship, the air rises it up just enough. Some guy figured this, and they sailed it out, right? It immediately went into, well, the next year, it went into just a knockdown battle with a British ship called the Watt. At the end of that, both of the ships were practically destroyed. They were both demasted. They were riddled with holes. They both had, they said that it was the worst naval battle of the war itself. After that, it was captured by the British. They took it to New York. Now, normally what the British would do if they captured an American vessel is they would convert it. They would use it, but the Trumbull was in such terrible condition. It was still so badly damaged from the fighting with the Watt that they scuttled it. So the ship was long gone. All right, and then we know about the Turtle. You don't know about the Turtle? All right, David Bushnell. He experimented with underwater explosives, and he perfected, I think by about 1775 or 1776, he perfected how to detonate gunpowder underwater, right? So it was decided that if we could build a vessel that could go under the water and into New York Harbor and up to a giant British warship, if we could drill a hole in the warship and attach one of these underwater mines and then get far enough away, and then it would explode, that we could attack British shipping in a way that they wouldn't even know they were being attacked, right? So in August of 1776, they actually tried it in New York Harbor. It didn't work. The detonator was two parts to it. There was a clockwork mechanism, which I think is pretty clever, but the only way they had to work it, they had a flintlock, the flintlock that fires the piece of flint, hits the steel. So if you can imagine, there's a clockwork mechanism that's going to have the thing go click, spark, poof. Yeah. It didn't explode. Here's the Turtle, okay. So the real Turtle, the real Turtle sank when the ship that was carrying it was sunk by the British. Can't really see it too well here. You can see why they called it the Turtle, right? It looks like two turtle shells stuck together. Here's the guy. He pedals like a bicycle, and this goes forward. And if he wants to go backward, he has to pedal the other way, right? He's got there's a water gauge in here that you can't see that he can pretty much, I think he can determine his depth. Can you see this right here? This is a drill. I don't know if you can see that clearly. And here's the handle. So when he gets under the ship and he gets right up to it, he's going to come and try to drill into it. And then that's attached to the rope here. He's going to let that go. You can't see it, but there's a big powder keg right here. And he only had I think there's only enough air in there for about 10 hours or maybe less. So it was really, they called for volunteers. They only got one guy. I don't know what they would have done if they had nobody, but at any rate, so Connecticut in more ways than one is considered the birthplace of submarines, if you discount Da Vinci and all his drawings, right? This is, yeah, okay. All right. All right, privateers. Do you know what privateers are? Privateer is a legalized pirate. You get what's called a letter of marque. So let's suppose you're a ship owner and you have a pretty good sized ship and you're used to trading with the West Indies. You get a letter from either the Continental Congress or the colonial and later on state government that allows you to attack British shipping, and you go out and you're a pirate, right? So the privateers in Connecticut, there were probably We think between 200 and 300 privateers. The reason we don't know exactly is that the state records don't always list them. Sometimes it'll say there were letters listed to a number of people, but it doesn't say how many ships they had, right? We think that about 500 British ships were taken by Connecticut privateers. And if you think about our location, if the British are based out of New York City, and you're in, let's say, New London was really the center of privateering. So you come out of New London, you sail, let's see, from your point of view, it would be that way. Sail around like Montauk Point. You go to am I doing that the right way? Does that make sense to you? Yeah. All right. You get close to, basically what you do is you sit about 5 miles off Sandy Hook, which is the southern point of New York, and then you wait for a big fat merchantman that's sort of sailing along at about 2 miles an hour, like, you know, think of a tractor trailer truck that can't go that fast, and you've got a sports car, right? So you run in, you fire a couple shots, the captain of the merchantman goes, don't shoot, I give up. You take the merchantman and you sail back to Connecticut. And then you have to give so much to the state, but you get to keep most of it, right? Including the ship, all right? So it's extremely lucrative, yes. It's also extremely dangerous because while we had 200 to 300 privateers, about half of the ships we lost to the British. So we'd get a ship and then we'd use it, and then the British would take it back and then they'd use it. So that happened quite a bit. At any rate, so our proximity to New York is going to be a real key here. So how are we doing for time here? Are we?
We are at 2:02.
Really?
You want to go faster?
All right. I'll do Saratoga in 10 seconds then. Okay. The British decided in late 1777 they wanted to attack the colonies once again. And they were coming from Canada, which was their major base, or one of the major bases, and the plan was threefold. The first is that General Howe, who's in New York City, he's going to march north up the Hudson River, and he's going to get to Albany. The second part of it is is actually Captain Colonel St. Ledger. He's going to lead a smaller force this way. He's coming out of Montreal down the Mohawk River Valley, and he's going to get into Albany here. And then the major force is coming under Burgoyne, 10 or 11,000 men marching south. They're going to sail down Lake Champlain. They're going to get out. They're going to march along. The problem with taking 10 or 11,000 men through the wilderness is you have to feed them every day. So he has an enormous supply train. And the other problem is he has about 4 wagons just dedicated to his stuff, because every day when he stops, they lay out carpets in the forest, and they put up tents, and they put up tables, and fine china, and linen, and 3 or 4 people cook him dinner. And and then he has wine, right? So, and all the officers, many of the officers have their wives, so it's really, if you can imagine, out in the middle of nowhere, you have this really fine dinner going on, right? So that means you're traveling really slowly. The first problem is that Howe decides not to come, so he's gone. He's out of the picture. He goes to Philadelphia instead. The second problem is St. Ledger's coming down here. Benedict Arnold hears of him, and Arnold takes a force of a few hundred men, and it's about Fort Oswego right here, that Arnold encounters a Native American that he knows. And Arnold has a real reputation with the Native Americans. They're afraid of him. They think he's crazy. They think he's dangerous. So when he's talking to the Native Americans, they say, "How big is your force?" He said, "Well, I only have a few men, but behind me, there's so many soldiers you can't count them." He said, "Imagine the leaves on the trees." So the Native Americans, who were the major force of St. Ledger, they go back and they say, "This isn't worth it because Arnold's coming with a very large army." So about several hundred Native Americans leave St. Ledger, and he's stuck. So he's defeated, and so that's gone. And so the primary here is going to be Burgoyne. And the thing that defeats Burgoyne is that you have volunteers from all over, from Vermont, from Massachusetts, from Connecticut, from New York, even from Pennsylvania. About 15,000 volunteers merge on Saratoga. So by the time he gets there, he only has about 6,000 men left, and he's facing a really superior force that's blocking the road, that has the highlands over the road. So he's going to fight two battles over a period of about 3 weeks, And again, the second battle is where Arnold is going to rally the American forces and essentially win the battle almost single-handedly. So Saratoga is the key, because after Saratoga, the British Army surrenders. So you've got about 5,000 or 6,000 British soldiers. They're paroled. We march them to Boston. They each have to sign a piece of paper. I will never come back and fight against the Americans again, and I promise. And then they get on the ships and they sail home. It's huge. It's the first real victory of the war. It convinces the French to sign the treaties of commerce and the treaties of mutual friendship. Out of this, what the British do is they decide they want to build a military base up in Penobscot Bay in Maine so that they can protect Nova Scotia, because they're afraid that the Americans are going to come in that direction. So we're going to send a naval expedition up there. So the American fleet, there's only 3 warships from the American fleet, but about 40 from Massachusetts. And we're going to engage in, it's about a 2-week battle, lay siege to the British. Unfortunately, the British are able to send word to the fleet in New York, and the fleet in New York arrives, and the American fleet is crushed, absolutely destroyed. The American ships actually try to escape up the Penobscot River, and the problem with that is you can only go so far in a warship, right? So at any rate, so this is really the end of all of the military. So we get Newgate Prison. Have we been to Newgate Prison? It's closed now, right?
I think they're reopening.
Are they? They are. Is it closed because we can't afford to open it?
Correct.
All right. That's a shame, isn't it? Okay, we know this, right? 1707 was the first copper mine in America. It was a prison starting in 1773 till 1827, right, when Wethersfield Prison opened. In 1775, the first 2 Tories that were arrested, Benjamin Church and William Franklin, who's Benjamin's son, they were sent to Connecticut. We were supposed to house them somewhere. We never sent them to Newgate. We moved them around from community to community because they were considered quite dangerous. But eventually we were going to use Newgate to house several Tories. There were probably about 1,000 Tories that were arrested. Some were chased out. Some said, "Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not really a Tory." Some said, "To heck with you," and we locked them up for a while. Have you been down in the? When I was a kid, you could go down the ladder, and it was like really depressing. Today, they dug it all out, and it doesn't seem quite as bad. But it was our first state prison in the United States. Okay, British raids. This is what I thought we'd get to this in about 10 minutes. So okay, the very first thing that happens for the British is that they're bottled up in Boston. And they're relatively safe, but they have limited supplies. So what they do is they send out their ships, and the ships are raiding along the coast, and they come to a town and they fire a couple of shots, and the people in the town, they lower their flag and say, "What do you want?" And they say, "Bring us 50 goats and sheep," and everybody complies. And they get to Stonington, and they fire on Stonington, and the people of Stonington fired back. Same thing happened during the War of 1812. Stonington has the honor, if that's an honor, of being the only community in America that was engaged in battles in both the Revolution and the War of 1812. If you go down to Stonington Point, they actually have 2 cannon that they used to fire at the British. So the British actually gave up because they said, we don't need this. There's a town just down the way that we can attack that would be very happy to send us some food, right? In 1777, Danbury was a source of military stores. Washington's army was up around West Point, which was 30 or 40 miles away there. So this was considered a safe place to store food. So the British led a major attack. 2,000 men landed in Norwalk, Connecticut, and marched north. They got into to Danbury. They burned houses, barns. I think there were about 1,500 tents that they destroyed, blankets, lots of food, and a couple of warehouses full of rum. And rather than dump the rum on the ground, they decided to drink it, which is why they were all drunk and or hungover when they were marching back and they encountered Benedict Arnold. So Then in February of 1779, they attacked Greenwich. There was a salt works in Greenwich. Now, today, we all think salt is bad, right? You go to the doctor, you say your cholesterol, you don't eat salt. For most of human history, we've tried to put salt into our diet because salt's actually good for you because every cell in your body has made up of water and salt, right? So the salt works in Greenwich was considered quite valuable. Salt was used for preserving food, among other things, especially salting meat. So the British raid here, pillaging, of course, but destroying the salt works was huge. And then later on that summer, they had pillaging attacks on New Haven, Fairfield, and Norwalk. And then the big one is Groton, New London on September 6, 1781. It was a major attack. New London was a center for privateering, and essentially, well, one of the things that was happening was Washington and Rochambeau were marching south to Yorktown, where Cornwallis had dug in and was waiting for the British fleet to rescue him. The British knew that was happening, so they were trying to distract Washington. So they thought if we launch a major raid along the Connecticut coast, not just a little raid, but a major raid, that Washington might get distracted and either turn around and come back, or at least send some of his troops back. That didn't happen. So we believe that the British were not just looking to attack Groton and New London, but actually to establish a fortification there from which they could attack the countryside and wreak havoc. Didn't really happen that way, right? So let me just skip ahead here. We got Danbury. Must be a quicker way to do this. Here we go, New London, all right. New London is the largest harbor on the Sound. All right, so the British, we did that. Let's get to here, all right. So there are two forts in Groton and New London. Fort Griswold, have we been to Fort Griswold? No, shame on you. It's it's beautiful. This is what it looks like today. It's a European star fort. It originally had, there was a parapet, there was a platform, there was actually a cedar phrasing, you know, the sharp stake sticking out. There were about 6 or 8 cannon. There was a barracks here. No, I'm sorry, the barracks was here. This is the powder storage room here. There are two, this was actually the curtain. You wanted them to attack that way because you could shoot at them from 3 sides. Yeah, it's a European star fort. Okay, this is a picture of the fort from the back. It's built right on the bedrock. In the area it's called Groton Heights, right? I have a lovely picture of it from about 1900 where you can look down, you see the river, and you see New London. Today you get up there and there's all these trees and electric boats over here, right? But it's on a really high hill. I take my classes there, and I always make them, we come out the sally port, the back door, we come all the way down to the bottom, and we're looking up maybe 100 or 125 yards, and I say, okay, now imagine it's September, it's about 95 degrees, you're wearing a wool uniform, you have a 30-pound pack on your back, you have a brown bass musket which weighs 12 pounds, the people up there are shooting at you, and I want you to run up this hill as fast as you can. And it seems like a real daunting task, because later on when I say, okay, let's go back to the car, and we walk up the hill, people get tired because it's a really steep hill. It's a great place for kids and dogs, frisbees and kites and things like that. Fort Trumbull, this is Fort Griswold here. Fort Trumbull is, have we been to Fort Trumbull? State Park. It's just, the federal government had it till about 97 or 98, and it was top secret because they did sound lab stuff and underwater engineering, things like that. Today it's a state park. This was a gun battery. So Fort Griswold up here was supposed to protect essentially the harbor itself. This protected the river. So what you had was, it wasn't a fort, the back was open, but along here you had guns so you could fire straight down into the mouth of the river. All right. This is the Ebenezer Avery House, which used to be down on the river. They moved it up here to be part of the fort. After the battle, what happened was the British, they had a number of wounded, and they didn't want to take anybody that they didn't think was going to survive. So they left about 40 people here in the Avery House. This became a makeshift hotel. So how are we doing for time? Do we have?
We're at 2:15.
We are? All right. This is probably a good place to end. Maybe next time I'll start with here and we'll get into the battle and we'll move forward. So, okay. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
I talk longer, but I have to go pick up my 7-year-old at school, so.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.